We are really fortunate to kick off this conversation with insights from our Federal Reserve Bank President Neel Kashkari and NeighborWorks CEO Paul Weech. It's actually perfect timing that we gather here today because Neel just finished a day and a half of an awesome conference on the Opportunity and Inclusive Growth Institute, where we were really thinking dynamically and innovatively about disparities. And Paul just kicked off a week-long training institute here in Minneapolis for housing and homeownership in the Midwest region. I have a few folks I'd like to recognize, and a very special thanks for being here today. Mary Tingerthal, who is the Commissioner for the Minnesota Finance Agency and a nationally recognized leader in the field of finance and commerce. Thank you, Mary. To our many state and tribal leaders, our NGO partners, thank you for being here as well and for your participation in this serious public policy discussion. And my terrific colleague from NeighborWorks, who's not here, but I hope is here in spirit, Steve Barbier, for contributing his steadfast and insightful leadership to this event and to the broader mission of homeownership for American Indian people. And to Dorothy Bridges, our Senior Vice President of Public Programs, and her wonderful support for Indian country development. We are here today to discuss the little talked about subject of homeownership in Indian country. It's seldom discussed, I believe, because it's a hard, complicated issue to get your head around and involves issues such as tribal sovereignty, land status, leasehold mortgages, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and secondary markets. Additionally, federal and state funding and support for Indian housing has been generally focused on the public housing model. Only in the past 2 decades has homeownership become a real option for reservation residents. However, many programs created to encourage mortgage lending in Indian country have not been entirely successful across the country. It's also a topic that concerns a mostly invisible segment of our population, American Indians and Alaska Native peoples. Making up 2% of the total US population, American Indians often are not reported in demographic or economic data, or are lumped in this unspecific other category. Nevertheless, American people are an integral and unique part of the US society, rich in history and burgeoning with talent and energy. Their lives, though, are marked by some of the most severe socioeconomic statistics of any other race or ethnicity. The scale of social disparities and economic inequalities in Indian country are really shocking. Take, for example, homeownership in Minnesota. With a rate approaching nearly 73%, Minnesota's homeownership rate is the highest in the nation, over 8% higher than the national average of 64.6%. However, the homeownership rate among American Indian households is just 46.7%, leaving a homeownership gap of over 30%. The good news is that the homeownership rate in Indian country is growing. But attempts to support homeownership on tribal trust lands, the vast amount of land on Indian reservations, has really not succeeded. Almost all of the mortgage lending to American Indians, 88%, has occurred on private land, not on trust land. Rather than be overwhelmed by these numbers, the Center for Indian Country Development has decided to tackle the complex work of addressing the interconnections of race, place, and economic opportunity through the lens of homeownership. We have formed a national Native homeownership coalition to examine a wide array of factors that impact homeownership on tribal trust lands, with the goal of amplifying the needs to restructure lending policies to better serve the American Indian population and to unlock the potential of these lands. Why home ownership? Well, many different reasons. First, homeownership to me is a wedge issue that forces us to confront the basic issues of access to capital, ranging from who's lending and who's not, to improving the borrower's overall financial skills. Homeownership is critical to sustaining a well-trained workforce and increasing the spending power in Indian country, all of which have broader implications for community and economic development. Access to homeownership opportunities is important in itself as a basic lifestyle choice and a significant personal investment option. A more vibrant market for private homes spurs improvement and development of community amenities, such as schools, libraries, recreational facilities, law enforcement, and so forth. It also relieves the pressure on traditional housing programs that mainly administer a stock of subsidized rental properties. Homeownership on trust land requires dealing with fundamental governance and land issues that affect all economic development in Indian country by unlocking the development potential of all reservation lands. And ultimately, building financial well-being is a predictor for success for virtually every outcome we care about, from health and education to employment, economic growth, and social stability. And finally, if I may, for me, this work is personal. My family's from the Standing Rock Reservation. We've had terrible housing insecurity, not being able to build a home for our families on the reservation. And that insecurity and instability and lack of choice and massive amounts of bureaucracy is just an injustice to us all. So today I ask you to imagine what Indian country could look like through the lens of homeownership. How do we break down barriers that keep families from these opportunities? And how do we make something of the land, unlock its economic potential, and create a place that's worthy of our young people now and for many generations? So that's the conversation today, and I hope you will engage robustly in the conversation with questions to our guest speakers. So against this backdrop, I'd like to turn to our featured speakers, and I'd like to start with our president, Neel Kashkari. Having just concluded the Opportunity and Inclusive Growth Conference, Neel, what does equitable opportunity look like from your perspective?
Well, first of all, thank you, Patrice, and thank you all for being here. It's an honor to be here with you. You may know the history. A few years ago, the Minneapolis Fed launched the Center for Indian Country Development, which is an enormously important initiative that Patrice was brought in on board to lead. She has a very strong team with Major, with Dick Todd, with many others, doing very important work on housing and beyond just housing. And so let me just start by saying how important this work is to our bank. And we can only be successful with your own participation. So thank you for being here. It's a critical part. For me, equitable opportunity is about everybody in the United States having a fair chance to build a better life for themselves and their families at the highest level. But if you go below that highest level, then it affects a lot of individual areas. That means education. So this bank is in a lot of work on early childhood education for the population at large and for Native populations. It means stable housing that Patrice was just talking about so that they have security in where they're going to live. It means things like healthcare, et cetera. So it means a lot of different things. But at the end of the day, for me, it means about people building the life that they want to have for themselves and for their children and for their grandchildren, and breaking cycles of poverty that exist certainly in many tribal communities, but also in other communities around the country. And so, the Native communities are enormously important to the work of this bank, this center, but beyond it as well.
Excellent, thank you. And Paul, you know homeownership writ large. You have an array of partners around the country. So let me ask you this very obvious question. Why is homeownership important to the economy?
Thank you, Patrice. I thought you did a great job in your opening remarks of describing those factors, but I'll respond to that. But first, I do want to say thanks to the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis, Minnesota, for hosting today's event, and to you especially for helping organize this event. And I also, as you did in your remarks, want to give a shout out to Steve Barbieri on our team, who can't be with us today, but I'll bet you nickel he's watching He's been a tireless champion for Native American communities, and we really just want Steve to know we're thinking of him. I also want to acknowledge our friends at Fannie Mae and the Federal Home Loan Bank of Des Moines, who also helped sponsor today's event, and say how honored I am to be on the stage with Neel Kashkari, who's a terrific leader of this bank and has done terrific leadership roles for our country. So, and it's great to see all friends and colleagues. So why is homeownership important? And I started, Patrice, when I thought about that question with the importance of housing stability. We know increasingly every day at how important housing stability is in other life outcomes. And it's almost a blinding flash of the obvious that kids aren't going to succeed in school if they have to move their homes during the school year and change schools and change school districts. And so housing stability is the first thing, and home ownership is probably the most stable of housing tenure choices. If with home ownership, a family has control over their house. With home ownership and a fixed rate mortgage, a family knows what the housing costs are going to be month to month. They can plan. They don't have to worry about the landlord raising the rent and forcing them to be displaced. Historically, we've also looked at home ownership as an asset building strategy, and it remains so as an important source of savings if people get fixed rate amortizing mortgages. Though, as we've seen through the financial crisis, it's not a sure thing. And so we at NeighborWorks America believe that it's totally critical that the home ownership journey is partnered with financial capability training and homebuyer education so that families know exactly, while this is a terrific tenure choice, they know exactly what the risks and opportunities are. And then finally, as you said in your remarks, Patrice, the homeownership in this instance on tribal lands is critical as a way to attract private investment. If we can get mortgage flows going, it should be part of other kinds of flows of private investment and private capital that's so critically needed on these often isolated tribal trust lands that have been lacking economic opportunity over a long time.
Excellent. Now I'm going to invite all of you to ask questions anytime along the way. I have a few more I'd like to ask our guests. So understanding the great disparities and the gaps, particularly in home ownership, how do we change the picture? And Neel, I'd like to go back to you because we've heard some really terrific ideas in the last day and a half, from data to models to really trying to understand the picture on the ground. What did you gather from the conversations in the last day and a half that we might apply in this situation?
I mean, there are many facets to this. Patrice, you've taught me about the legal challenges of land ownership in different tribal communities. So those are hugely important legal challenges that need legal solutions, and I think we're doing work and we've done work to try to make progress there. Part of it, I think also, so that's one avenue. Another avenue that we heard about yesterday at lunch from Sandra Samuels in the Northside Achievement Zone is raising expectations for everybody so that they see themselves as homeowners, so they see their children as getting that good education. So that becomes the norm, that becomes the expectation. If people have that expectation for themselves, it becomes much more achievable to go overcome the obstacles that are between them and achieving that goal. And so I think conferences like this, in addition to tackling the actual technical obstacles that need to be tackled, getting the message out that this is within reach, this should be a goal, and there are all these benefits that Paul just talked about. I think that also is important too.
I think you're spot on. Many American Indians have not grown up in a culture of home ownership. So that's a new, novel approach to housing. What we're looking at right now is a lot of overcrowdedness and not a lot of opportunities to develop housing options. So the expectation, I think, is something that we need to look at and think about as a cultural component to home ownership. And so, Paul, I sure would like to ask you, in terms of the work that you've seen in your array of programs out in the field, what are some of the projects, what are some of the models that are working and working well to create home ownership opportunities in Indian country?
Well, I'd say first of all that it's a huge challenge even for the groups that are doing it well, and because of all of the technical and other issues that you all have raised. But I'm looking at our colleague Roland from the Native Partnership for Housing, based in Gallup, New Mexico, is doing home ownership in a way that makes a lot of sense, which is he's providing a variety of home buyer education, financial capability services. He's also able to do the lending, and he's doing the housing development. Because all of those things are going to go into successful homeownership programs. How do we lower the cost? How do we put a product on site that's affordable? How do we build the demand side, help the consumer be ready to accept the mortgage? And then to the extent that private capital isn't flowing as it should to these places, how can a CDFI, a Native American focused CDFI, aggregate and bring the kinds of capital that a family might need to go from the demand to the supply side and own the home?
That's the ideal model for sure, absolutely for sure. So let me invite the participants to ask questions of our guests, and many of you are deeply involved in this work. I know I see Mike Smith there, and I see Karen Diver, and I see many other people who are really upfront and close and personal in the communities with this. What are some of the issues that you're seeing that are either obstacles to home ownership or models that are bringing home ownership as a reality to our Native communities? And we have mics going around the room. We have Dick, Todd, and Nikki who will be sharing the microphone with you. So who would like to start the conversation? Thank you. So I think I'm going to call on somebody in the room, and I think I'm going to call on Jewel Burnett because you're standing right there by Dick. Dick, Todd, if you'd give Jewel the microphone. I'm picking on you. I'm a former law professor, and this is totally the classroom style, right?
I remember this treatment well.
So Neel, Jewel, you're working with First Tribal Lending. You're a huge player in mortgage lending. What are you seeing on the ground, and what are you seeing work, and what are you seeing not work?
I'll start with the negatives and hopefully finish with the positives, I guess. I don't think anything's really changed in the last 18 years since I've been doing this. Same hurdles, same solutions. It's about building relationships, making contacts, finding those people that really want to help that homeowner, help the lender get through the process. The biggest hurdle that's out there right now, and you guys mentioned it up there, it's the education. It's flat out education. Our people don't know how to become homeowners. They don't know what credit is. They haven't seen their credit. They have bad credit in some cases that maybe was their doings, and some of it obviously was done by IHS, which we can get past. So I spend a lot of time, and my team spends a lot of time educating every day, but the credit counselors and those people that are doing that out in the field every day, those are our gold nuggets. Those people are worth their weight in gold. Second hurdle, BIA. I've got a lot of friends at the BIA, create a lot of relationships at the BIA. But there's more to be done. Unfortunately, people get older, people retire, so we have to regain and build a new relationship. So it's just like tribal councils turn over, tribal housing boards turn over. It's a constant re-education. It never ends, and it won't end as long as I continue to do the work. I mean, it's going to be a constant education, time and time again, day after day. So, but it's all about relationships. You know, we got to build relationships. We got to find those pockets of people who want to help us help the people that we're dealing with every day. That's where I found that's where I found my success.
All right. Thank you very much. All right, I have somebody else in mind, unless there's a question from the audience. Oh, great, we have one in the back, and
Thank you. Mine is three-part. The first part is there's a lot of turnover within some of the agencies where counselors are trained and they might change jobs and they lose their certifications, etc. And I'm wondering to what extent the people who, as they change jobs, can be pooled because it's a lost resource. They already have the training, and people need to access them as far as filling the gap for education. And then the second part is they're smaller organizations, and some are startups or some are trying to develop their housing programs. But now with all the restrictions that you have to first be HUD approved, and there's a hurdle as far as technical assistance to become HUD approved agency before you have access to all these other things, that needs to fill the gap. NeighborWorks had filled the gap in technical training at one point, but they no longer have that. And the third, because you're a attorney, is we're seeing seniors being targeted for losing their homes. And NeighborWorks came out recently and said, oh, gee, we didn't know that tax forfeiture is an area that there's a lot of education needed, and nobody's paying attention to that or keeping the data, et cetera. And there isn't the help out there to help these seniors.
Can you tell me where you're from, what part of the country?
I'm here in Minnesota.
Here in Minnesota. So you said a couple of things. I'm looking around for my staff to bail me out here. Our training should still be available, though maybe it's a case of getting scholarships for the training. It sounds like to the extent that it's systemic, that you're losing many counselors in your area, there should be place-based trainings available, and maybe we can see if there are partners in the state that would be willing to sponsor place-based training for this particular need as a way to kind of increase the capacity and certifications available to you, but also maybe to tackle your pooling idea. And then the third one, NeighborWorks. I lost your third thought.
I think it was the target of elders.
Oh, target of elders. Again, it's an issue I'm not familiar with, so I'm sort of looking for maybe one of my NeighborWorks staff people here in the area who might know something about what happened.
Here we go.
Good afternoon. Thanks for hosting us. I'm Sheila Rice. I work for NeighborWorks Great Falls in Great Falls, Montana. We actually have a very active tax foreclosure or tax forfeiture program where we comb the tax rolls and find out who's close, who's getting close, and then reach out to them, sometimes in person, knocking on the door. And we started that for exact reason that was stated. We saw people coming to us and saying, I'm going to lose my house. I've already lost my house. So it was a way for us to proactively attack that problem. We also were successful in getting a legislative change this year for the noticing. So there's an additional noticing procedure as well, so people understand more that the tax forfeiture is going to happen.
So what I heard, Sheila, though, was there was something that we weren't supporting in some way. Is that correct?
No, you just
Okay. Well, that's an important issue that that
I'd
I
love
know
to know
that-
more. Love to know more about it.
Yes, absolutely.
Good afternoon. I'm Linda Lee Retka, Program Director with National American Indian Housing Council. And we do provide Pathways Home Train the Trainer under HUD's Community Compass demand response system at this time. We have, in the past year, provided approximately 6 trainings throughout the nation. Prior to the change in the funding, at one point NEIHC was receiving training and technical assistance funding directly. At that time, with the HUD funding, we provided the participant manuals for the tribal entities that delivered homebuyer counseling sessions and training sessions within their communities. At this time, we do not have funding to provide those manuals. However, we are continuing to provide the Pathways Home Train the Trainer. And we also are able to provide technical assistance in developing homeownership programs within tribal communities. And one other point I wanted to make is that the lady in the back made a good point, that tribes and tribally designated housing entities are not eligible to become housing counseling centers under the HUD requirements at this time. And unless they form a nonprofit.
Oh, I see.
And so if there's anything that you could do to assist with eliminating that requirement, it would be very helpful to our tribal communities.
That sounds like a to-do list thing for the coalition.
Yes, I think that would be an issue for the National Native Homeownership Coalition to take on. A couple of the major programs, federal programs, are USDA, Rural Development, HUD when it's 184 program, and all of these need to work together brilliantly, almost fit together perfectly as a puzzle to make it all work together. And there are many people on the ground, like Linda's program and so forth, that are actually the ones that are working with the community, the people, as well as the lenders. So you can see how this is a really multi-layered, multi-dimensional challenge for all of us. We have another question in the back.
Here we have on here.
Okay.
Brian Levinson with NeighborWorks. Paul, I just wanted to clarify on the previous question about the tax foreclosure issue. I think what may have been referred to was a blog that we had recently from Lou Tisler as he was leaving and talking about the next wave of foreclosure now that the foreclosure crisis has mitigated was tax lien foreclosure, and huge problem that's growing.
Got it.
Hi, I'm Danny Paratus. I'm from Boyce Ford Housing Department, about an hour south of Canada. And generally, I've been working just with our HUD and rental units. And just from that experience and trying to get in home ownership actual wait list going, in terms of providing access to even local lenders. We're talking about fairness and equality. What we really need are technical assistance funds for providing that judicial infrastructure to make sure that outsider lenders feel that their investment in us is protected.
So that raises a question of funding technical assistance, tribes themselves looking at their development opportunities, need to look at their own governance infrastructure, look at the resources that they need to put in place, the legal framework, the judicial proceedings that are all part of the lending process. So you raise a really good point. And what I'm hearing is that there are entry points into this big problem, and it all takes some resources and a whole lot of money and a whole lot of commitment as well. We have another question.
Morning, or good afternoon, everybody. I'm Jim Nordland. I'm the the new executive director for NeighborWorks Alaska. I had the opportunity to work with Teresa in my previous job at Rural Development, and I'm new to NeighborWorks. But given what we've been trying to do in Alaska under rural development for years, confronted a lot of the barriers, I guess, to native home ownership. And I guess I want to agree with Joel and others around the table here who have said that education, financial literacy, financial capacity, those kinds of home ownership education is probably the foremost barrier to help folks in Indian country move into home ownership. And one of the and I don't mean to put Paul on the spot here, but I think one of the advantages that I've seen at NeighborWorks is we do a great job, many of the NeighborWorks affiliates, with home ownership education, but we've done a little bit of it ourselves at NeighborWorks on the North Slope in Alaska through a number of native villages, but our trainers are urban white people, and I think they did a great job. But I think that there's room for improvement, and I'm not speaking of NEHIC or any of the other OESTA or any of the other really qualified organizations that do training, but at least in terms of our exposure in Alaska, would be really great to have culturally relevant training developed for our use in Alaska and probably other parts of Indian country, so that training is much more meaningful to the folks, even language specific. There are a number of folks in Western Alaska who only speak Yupik, on the North Slope only Inupiat. So culturally relevant training, I think, is something that we could maybe do some more pioneering in NeighborWorks. Paul, just a thought.
Oh, no, and I'm extremely interested in that. About a year and a half ago, we launched a race, ethnicity, diversity, and inclusion initiative, and I personally launched it for a variety of reasons, but one of the things about me is that I married an anthropologist. And so I'm really, really interested in cultural diversity in our society. And as I got prepared for this, just sort of thinking about the 566 federally recognized tribes and the I had 566 in my notes. That's right. And the different histories and cultures and languages, as you point out, that presents is such a rich opportunity, but also creates a challenge as we try to create equitable access to services and access to things like homebuyer education that's both language and culturally relevant. As well as I thought where you're going is something that we as a network as a whole are talking about, and how we also, as a network, do a better job of hiring employees who have the cultural competencies to deliver these services. And in many cases, that means doing a better job of our hiring and training of the people who are the trainers who are providing the services. So it is a big challenge, but something that we're committed to work with the network on. Obviously, all of this is going to take resources and in general, the way I'm interpreting many of the comments on the availability and the quality and access to these counseling and education services is boiling down in a lot of ways to a resource question.
Hi, I'm Bernie Johnson-Clark. And something that really catches my attention is the homebuyer education. I'm formerly a financial educator, education manager in consumer credit counseling, and I'm currently a realtor. And I love everything about the homebuyer education. Something for all of our tribes to think about is when we're thinking about who will be providing the training, not everybody is interested in talking about money, which is really a barrier for finding facilitators within communities. That's something that I experienced when I worked for my own tribe, and then just doing consumer counseling education and working with partners, organizations here in the Twin Cities, non-Indian. There are a lot of people who will get trained and then who will hire consumer credit counselors or educators to provide the education because they don't want to talk about it. So it's a big barrier, but homebuyer education is something that we definitely need within our communities. So that was all I wanted to say.
Thank you, Bernie.
Hello, I'm Mike Gozzi. I'm the CEO of American Indian Community Development Corporation in Minneapolis. And for me, the education piece starts on the other end of the spectrum. I don't believe that the people putting together programs truly understand the plight of the American Indian today in the country. And I say that because I have been involved with a lot of programs, still involved with an Annie and AFI program, Assets for Independence, that has been zeroed out. Talked to the people yesterday, and the 30th is their last day. And when I first took on that, I kind of drank the tea. You know, they said, oh yeah, well, people can save, they can be in the program for up to 2 years. And I thought, 2 years, that's a long time. Until I got into addressing the barriers that were the hindrance for people to get where they wanted to go. 2 years was not a long time. 2 years didn't, you know, I had people that took 5 years to get them into a house, because they had no credit, little credit, poverty comes into it. When you have, I know I have a married couple, if they make $35,000 a year, I think I got a wealthy couple, you know? And so the poverty end of it, and it's hard to get people to save money when there's no money to save. Even if you're gonna double it, triple it, or now we're looking at going 8 times. You know, but when it comes down to feeding my children or paying my electricity or some of the things that we all take as normal, having a cell phone, having cable TV, it's very difficult. And so part of it is, you know, we're given these parameters to do these programs, but yet the parameters don't meet the needs of the population that we deal with. And I see that not only in the housing industry, but in a lot of areas. And so part of the education piece has to come, you know, I've never been asked about my thoughts on a number of things, you know, which has surprised me. But then when they're decided, then they want me to apply, you know. And so I don't understand that. And I believe that there are areas that, especially because it's so dramatic. The disparities are so great, and so, but there are successes, and we have to focus on the successes that we find in every one of our communities, and focus on that and ask the question, how did you do that? You know, because most of the time we focus on the disparity, the people, you know, the people that didn't make it. We focus on what didn't happen for them, where I think we need to change that to what happened to the ones that were successful, and we need to replicate that, and we need to ask the people that will be part of the process. We need to get them involved sooner and take their advice and use it.
Hey, Mike, just to follow up on that, so give us an example of just a typical Indian family that is successful in buying a home. What do they look like? What's their life like?
This is an example of a family that was the first person to get in the IDA program. And the husband worked for the city of Minneapolis. The mother, I don't believe they were married at the time. They had 5 children, right? And but they had no credit. And if they had credit, it was bad credit. It was something like, you know, I remember when I went to college, somebody sent me a credit card. Never had one before. Wow.
Was that fun?
That was fun, yeah. But I see the same thing with people with cell phones. They get into a cell phone plan, and it's $14.95 a month, and they use it. And they get a bill for $700, and the phone's gone. Well, that bill is past, but it's there haunting them, you know. And so a lot of them had either no credit, or this particular people had bad credit, and they had unlawful detainer from being thrown out of an apartment, because in my world here in Minneapolis, I run into renters that pay 70% of their income into rent, right? It's not sustainable. It's not sustainable. So there's like a 3-month cycle that people go through. Change the subject. But this particular group, their car broke down in the middle of it. And so they had to buy a car. So for every $1,000 of payment of expense, there's $10, you know, and it makes a difference in what you can qualify for. And they had life instances that happened, but it took them 4 years and plus to get it. And then the house they bought was a house that was built with subsidies. It probably cost $350,000 to build it. Right? There were subsidies. There were subsidies from the state of Minnesota, city of Minneapolis. The neighborhood put in money. This was a community City Lakes Community Land Trust, and so $60,000 was taken off the top from the land trust. The $350,000 home, their mortgage, with all the subsidies that we provided, and they were in the AFI program, and so we matched their savings of $2,000 with another $4,000, and really went and got the NAHI grant from the Federal Home Loan Bank of Des Moines, Native American Housing Initiative. Their mortgage was for $106,000. The house started at $350,000. The subsidies brought it down to where they could afford to live in the house and be sustainable, you know, be successful. So that's an example. And it's not the only one like that. And my conversation with Mary or Rick with the Housing Finance Agency is, this is the kind of subsidies we need. We need a value gap to bring the cost of construction down. We need affordability gap to make it affordable to the target market, which was at, I think, 50% AMI.
And in that example, thank you for that. In that example, you mentioned that the husband or the father had a job with the city, and was it one income, or I'm just
curious? 2 incomes.
2 incomes.
Yeah, it was 2 incomes. Yeah, and with 5 children, with life happens. It took them a long time to continue to save, but that 2 year of savings went out the window. You know, we have several people that start in a program but have a catastrophe, something in their life that makes them withdraw from the program. They take their money with them. Then we start over again. And so there's a lot of just barriers, but the bigger thing is the poverty piece, that people do not have the income to, it costs me the same to build a house in Edina as it does to build a house in South Minneapolis off Franklin Avenue. And without subsidies to adjust that. And I think the return on investment is what we really have to focus on. And because family stability, I believe that for family stability and having a home is priceless to the families. And the state, the county, the city will get their money back in taxes. They'll get their money back in earnings as they develop and grow greater in their earning capacity. They will get it back in their children, those 5 children that will have learned the benefit of home ownership and asset building and making payments and having a roof over your head that you can lay down and be happy with. And so I don't know, and I go back to early childhood education, where art has proven the investment into early childhood education is so astronomical that people don't believe it. And I think that home ownership in any country could do the same thing.
Thank you for that, Mike. We have another question. So, Mike, you speak about you speak about the homeownership experience here in the cities, and that's a really, really important part of Indian country. And we have close ties and deep connections to the reservation. So, I'm also trying to make that leap to our reservation families as well.
Well, in here, sorry to take up your time. I started the home ownership program for the Ho-Chunk Nation. And an example I'll use is that we spend a lot of time in our tribal entities, or tribal areas, on not paying taxes, trust land, right? I had 2 brothers, and one brother built a house on trust land on one side, on the east side of Highway 54. The other brother built a house on fee simple land on the west side of Highway 54. Today, the house that was built on trust land has either the same value or less value than the day it was built, because you can only sell it to a tribal membership, tribal member. You have to get a lease from the VIA, and you go through jump through a bunch of hurdles. The one on the west side of the street, that house has appreciated. Not only has it appreciated, but when he had enough of an asset, he wanted to start a business. And he used the equity in his house to start a business. Now today, he has 15 people working for him because he was able to use his investment in his home as an asset to create other assets and to create a better life for him and his family and for the 15 people that work for him.
This is Karen.
I guess we have
Hey.
Karen. All right, we'll go to Karen, and then we'll go over here.
I almost had to go chairwoman.
Oh, sorry.
I wanted to challenge NeighborWorks just a little bit. It's unfortunate when it gets reduced down to diversity and inclusion. We're talking about political status in Indian country. So it's not enough just to do a cultural understanding, although that's a piece of it, especially for the clients. You need to do a deep dive. This is about federal Indian law and policy, and it's an area of expertise all on its own. So you're either going to go whole hog, or you should find good partners on the ground who have that, as well as the cultural competency. But we have tons of people who've went through trainings and come into Indian country, and it just doesn't work. It's like another person coming in to study you, and they're going to go write a paper for their master's thesis or something. You know what I mean? So you're either an Indian serving organization, and you dedicate yourself to it, and you dive deep, and you understand the complexities. But it got glossed over, and this is a perfect example of why you need that level of expertise. When this young lady from Boys Fort was talking about training, she was talking about dealing with banks and foreclosures and other things and having them submit themselves to tribal court under tribal authority. And banks don't know how to do that, and they don't do it, and so then it restricts the number of lenders that are willing to work in Indian country. That's why Section 184 was such a hard program, because tribes had to do a lot of adjusting in terms of their leasing and other things like that, and take very big organizational leaps in order to qualify to be a 184 lender, but nothing compelled the banks to do it. So they got to cream off the top and still have a loan guarantee. But it didn't dive deep. We need our native CDFIs and other organizations, the ones that are willing to get those populations where it isn't 10 years of a great credit record. They can understand the life, what's going on in Indian communities and take on a little bit more risk. But the price then ends up being, right, a little bit greater interest rate because it's program funding. They don't have the economy of scale that commercial lenders do. And then as far as leasing, people were nodding their heads about having to go through the BIA, but that's another infrastructure piece for tribes, and it could be a piece that someone can help take on to help tribes have the capacity to do some of these things as well in developing their ordinances. Fond du Lac was the first one in Minnesota, first tribe in the country to take over land leasing from the feds and have access to the federal database. We never talked to the BIA about land leasing. We can do it like that. So there are things that can be done from a tribal perspective, but tribes were never taught what the continuum of care is, especially about that homeowner piece, which is the end of the continuum of care. That's the good stuff, right? It's all program housing before that. It's either low-income rentals or low-income homeownerships. They're not geared at all towards moderate income, middle income, and of course, high income can find their own solutions, right? Because they're marketable, right? So a part of this is building the capacity of tribal communities and seeing what we could do to either build the nonprofit partnerships, whether they're ones around in the area or the capacity of some of the ones who have learned how to do that. But then some of it is actually with tribes themselves to build their capacity. And then also any vendor who's going to work in Indian country has to get that they're dealing with the government and that they have the ability to promulgate rules and have their own sets of authorities that need to be managed as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen. We have another question here.
Before the other question, though, I just want to accept the feedback that I am a white guy, grew up in the suburbs in the East Coast, and there is an awful lot I need to learn about working in Indian country, and I welcome be going on the journey and learning more and being more effective at being a spokesperson for these causes and finding the right partners and deferring to the people who actually know this work and do it well. So if I said something that was inappropriate, I apologize. But trust me, that I'd love to know more. And I just wanted to say that. So thanks.
All right, we have a question.
Hi, my name is Harold Melcher, and the discussion has been centered around these hurdles, and one of them, of course, is cultural, the other is education. Is there a generational hurdle here as well? Are young people in Native communities even aspiring to homeownership in the same way that their parents and grandparents' generation have before them? I know that people in my social circles, which are radically different than the population that we're talking about now, aren't talking about homeownership in the same way as our parents. And so I'm just wondering if that is another piece of the puzzle here, and I'm sure that someone in the room might have more insight on that than I. That's an honest question. So.
That's a good question. Do we know about generational differences in housing and homeownership patterns? I know here in the cities, we're seeing a very tight market. Rentals are going up, housing prices are going up. People are opting for rentals. I still have an assumption, I guess, that homeownership is almost an ultimate goal. That if you reach homeownership, it's almost like, oh, you've succeeded in one way or the other. Do you have an opinion on that?
But he's asking about the young Native kids, and I don't know. I mean, looking at all of you, what do you all think?
Danny from Boys Fort again. So I have a couple young families that approach me, and they are interested in becoming homeowners. These two particular households did grow up in rental housing. I see it on two sides. So there are those two households I will talk about, but then there's also the ones that grew up on subsidized housing. And it's a hard spin to get that particular group to even consider becoming a homeowner for themselves in terms of, spin factor, right? Like you can afford it, but we as a tribe, have set very low rents in some of our older stock. I'd say maybe $215 for a 3-bedroom, which is very affordable. Plus, the housing department takes on, all the maintenance costs. So that is a hard sell, and that's something that we can't change overnight. People have been used to budgeting this way so low sometimes for their housing costs that it is nearly impossible to start even that conversation. Well, you can have a mortgage maybe at the same rate, but then you're going to have all the costs associated with the maintenance responsibilities, and then teaching people how to, have that emergency savings and keep that there just for housing. Again, incomes might be fixed, and life does happen, and that money does go to other things, even though it's planned, and you try your best to save it for that furnace that's going to go down in a couple years, but it does go elsewhere, because not only that, we have very close, and this is being very general, but close-knit communities. My cousin over there down the street, maybe I need to help that person out because maybe their car went to heck on them and they need to get to work, which might be an hour away at the other district of our reservation. So, it's all very complicated, but again, hard sell. But to those families that are interested and are going for it, again, I think we were talking about there's a lot of programs out there for low income or extremely low income. We neglect to realize that we do have families that are at a moderate income. And just for an example, if someone were to work for Boy Sport and stay quite some time, you do get, so long as your performance reviews come back awesome, you can get up to like a 5% increase every year. If you're there for a long time, there's a good chance that you're going to have a quote-unquote moderate income. There is not a lot of down payment assistance. Again, there's not a lot of savings, and 2 years worth of savings isn't probably going to get you enough funds to actually put that down payment on. So where do you go for those monies? You don't go anywhere. Just from what I know about right now, and if anybody knows about down payment assistance for those that are above that low income level, let me know, because I'm looking for those monies right now for, that one household. The other household actually did buy, I think it was a trailer, and now there are mold issues in the unit. So not only, they did achieve that goal, but lack of education on what to do in purchasing a home, what to look for. I'm not sure how it was inspected before they made that purchase. I wasn't a part of that process, but now they're coming to the housing department for funds to remediate the mold. We used to have an environmental air quality program that was done in 2014. So, and this just isn't in the housing industry, it's across Indian country, like funds are leaving us. So, that's kind of what I'm seeing. Oh yeah, mold remediation, if you guys have funds, let me know. Thank you.
So Patrice, I think the only comment I'll make on that is we don't have data on Native American kids and their aspirations for buying homes. But we recently held a conference in Memphis on turning the tide on persistent rural poverty. And at the conference, we released a white paper written by 4 strong nonprofits on strategies for addressing areas of persistent poverty. And obviously, this is a huge challenge for Native American communities on the tribal lands. Because of the 184 census tracts in America that are majority Native American, 139 of them are areas of persistent poverty, where the poverty rates have been above 20% for more than 30 years. And one of the authors of that paper was Crystal Cornelius from Owisa First Nations. And one of the things she said that stood out for me in answer to your question was her measure of success of our efforts to drive economic opportunity to tribal lands is if 5 years from now, the kids in those communities stay and buy a home. It's that we've created the opportunities for them where they're not feeling like they need to move off someplace else, that they're in the community where they want to live and the economic opportunities are there for them. And so I think whatever the data says or the demand aspirations are, I love her vision of one of the markers of whether we're making progress on this.
Major, yes, please.
Yeah, I'd like to at least respond to that a little bit, and then there's a couple other comments I wanted to make. I think it'll evolve into the overall discussion as well, and that is, I think it's important for us to keep in mind when you ask that question how it relates to this generation now as opposed to even just a generation or two before. We need to look at it in context of housing, native housing on the reservation, as well as native housing off the reservation, because it's different categories that we're talking about. I don't know how many here are tribal members that have purchased a home on the reservation. I know for myself, I've purchased a home on the reservation as well as off the reservation and kind of experienced both of that. And Neel, you talked about kind of what does that family look like? And I think there's, again, depending on the context, it's going to look different in many circumstances. But a couple opportunities there is that, like within our family, our parents were Northern Cheyenne tribal members. Both of them were Northern Cheyenne tribal members. And little did I realize how fortunate we were, because they actually acquired land on the reservation, because a tribal member can buy land from another tribal member. They were able to do that, to put together land in order to build a home. And so I think that education part is really important, like what Jules said, many different levels of education, because we were being educated as we saw our parents become homeowners on the reservation. So that starts to pass on, and I think the more that our tribal members, and that's the importance of our tribal members owning homes on and off the reservation, is that we start to teach one another that this is how we can do it. I too went through that same example, Michael, of 5 years to get a mortgage, the first mortgage. And I was bankable, and I'd moved back to the reservation, but 5 years in order to do that. I was astounded because I'd already owned property in California, and it takes a matter of months in order to purchase a home. But we were committed to being there. And I think that's something else culturally we have to keep in mind. The purpose for home ownership depends on the family. It may not be, since the market isn't always growing on the reservation, it may not be necessarily to resell. It's really to pass on, to pass on to your relatives in some way. So it's a different type of, you still can build that home up, and you see tribal members doing that and have that pride of home ownership. But sometimes it's with a different purpose of doing that, and I think we have to also keep that in mind. One of the most important things that I saw when I returned back to the reservation after working off the reservation was the joblessness. It's hard to buy a home if you don't have a job. And if there aren't any jobs, then other people are looking at you like, well, don't take my job, because A, I want to feed my family, and B, I want a home as well. So I think education to tribal leadership is important in making sure that they're a part of that process of helping to create an environment for jobs to grow. To attract tribal members to come back and start businesses is important, I think. To create that environment so that we can start to see some of the jobs grow, because what I've experienced is that a lot of times the jobs grow right off the reservation. But tribal members will still want to go to that job, work there, but find a way to live on the reservation if they're fortunate to be able to do that. But there certainly are a number of these challenges, and we've heard a lot of them already about the legal infrastructure, the court system, and things like that allow lenders to have a sense of comfort to come on the reservation and do more business. I know there's native banks out there and other banks as well that are really looking to try to become a part of that ability to lend more in Indian country. And I do want to say this, as Jewel was a part of my first
foray into getting a home loan. So having someone that you can talk to that knows and can navigate through that system helps tremendously, because there's other folks that we did contact that didn't have that understanding of what it's like in Indian country to try to become a homeowner, that couldn't advise us, they couldn't lead us down the road. But having folks like Jewel and others to do that really does open it up more for potential home buyers, because I ran into too many of my tribal members who gave up. After 2 years, 3 years, they're like, well, we're not going to move to the reservation then. We'll just stay in the other community as well. So I think there's a lot of work to do, but I think as we start to define what it is that we're trying to do and how to do it, I think we can certainly make a lot of progress.
That's a great way to summarize this first part of our conversation, and thank you for that, Major. Thank you for all of the comments that you've shared with us. I think the big themes we're deriving from this is persistence and commitment, that we have to piece together a lot of different resources to make it all work, and it takes more than a village to do this kind of work. I'd like to thank our guest, Paul Weech from NeighborWorks America, and Neel Kashkari, the president of the Minneapolis Fed, for starting us off on this conversation. And now we're going to dig deeper. We're going to transition now to regional leaders panel, and I'd like Mary Tingerthal to come up and our other panelists as well. Let's thank Paul and let's thank Neel very well.
Nice to meet you.
right.
And that you did such a good job.
Sorry.
You're such a super.
Didn't mean to laugh. Hello, testing.
We're
hot mics. Can you hear me? So I think we're going to get started. Just want to say, Mino Gijigud, or good afternoon, everyone. I'm Nikki Paradas, and I'm from the Boys Fort Band of Chippewa, and I'm also a project director at the Center for Indian Country Development here at the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis. And I work closely with our center's National Native Homeownership Coalition, or NNHC. And I just want to say I'm honored today to be able to introduce the moderator of our next panel, our regional leaders discussion. And our moderator is Mary Tingerthal, and she's the commissioner of Minnesota Housing Finance Agency. And so Mary comes to us with a long and distinguished career in fostering the well-being of communities right here in Minnesota, and particularly through financing programs for affordable housing. I know that Mary began her appointment as commissioner for Minnesota Housing under Governor Mark Dayton in 2011, where she led some pretty innovative home improvement lending programs. In 2012, Mary also was involved in the establishment of Gamaji Mino Bima Dizian, which means together we're beginning a good life. And that project has served a significant American Indian homeless population in the city of Duluth. And I believe it was a project that was over $6 million, half of which was funded from the Minnesota Housing Agency. And I know that Mary has lifted up this project as a good example of what can happen when, tribes and agencies and many stakeholders come together. So, Mary has a long and close affinity to all of the issues that we're discussing today. And I just wanted to ask everyone to please join me in welcoming her. Thank you.
Good afternoon, and can you hear me? Good afternoon, and enough about me. You've already gotten warmed up on the previous panel, and we decided as panelists that what we wanted to do for introductions is to have each of our panel members take just a couple of minutes to talk about what brought you to be here today on this panel to talk about homeownership. And I'm going to start with my friend Karen Diver at the other end of the panel.
I've had about 30 years in housing operation and development in the nonprofit sector and for tribes. And then I was the chairwoman of the Fond du Lac Band for 9 years, and brought some new models of housing as staff and chairwoman to Fond du Lac, and really looking at developing out that continuum of care, coming from the broader housing industry, not understanding why we only did it the same two crappy ways that the feds did it for us forever, right? Why aren't we really exploring all of these other ways? And so tried some innovative partnerships and program models. And then I fulfilled the last 14 months of the Obama administration as his special assistant for Native American affairs. So I got to look at housing issues from a broad policy perspective and regulatory perspective for the administration.
Great, thank you, Robert.
Yeah, Bujun and Magana, greeting all my relatives. I'm Robert Liljegren. I'm currently the CEO of the Native American Community Development Institute, or NACD, in South Minneapolis on East Franklin Avenue. A key initiative of NACD's is a community-led vision of an American Indian cultural corridor along East Franklin Avenue, and leveraging the strong and historic Native residential presence, but also leveraging this a high level of property ownership by Native organizations, individuals, or tribes all along the corridor. Also the presence of a light rail station along the corridor. Before coming to NACD for a year and a half, I was the interim CEO at Little Earth of United Tribes in South Minneapolis as well. So that's residential, community, as well as wraparound services. Before Little Earth, I served for 12 years on the Minneapolis City Council, vice president of the City Council. I was the first tribal member ever elected to public office in the city of Minneapolis. And since I was elected, there have now been 4 other Native Americans elected to office, and I just like to mark that progress. On the City Council, I served on the Community Development Committee as Secretary of the MCDA, and on the Community Development Committee, which really focused a lot on housing and home ownership. I am a resident of Phillips, the Phillips area in South Minneapolis, rapidly redeveloping part of Phillips and long involved in social, environmental, and economic justice issues. I am a housing developer myself. I co-own about 24 housing units all on the block where I've lived for almost 35 years. And while I was on the council, I worked quite a bit with tribal nations, trying to encourage additional investment, specifically housing investment here in the city with some success and some not so successful. And while at Little Earth, we executed the final sales of a pilot project of 5 home ownership units for Native people, with some success or varying degrees of success. And and I'm very happy to be here. And I was thrilled to be asked to be part of this panel, as I'm not specifically a housing expert, but I feel like I'm deeply steeped in the urban Indian community here in Minneapolis.
Very good, thank you. Rollin?
Rollin Wood. I'm kind of the anomaly in the panel here. Although I am enrolled Cherokee and I've been on reservations and around reservations my entire life. I've worked in the nonprofit sector until about 3 years ago, and I received a phone call to see if I would join Native Partnership for Housing as the executive director. And I was trying to figure out to this day how that happened, because I was actually working on a business plan for some Navajo friends of mine for the Four Corners area. And I was going to be going from Four Corners to Sinaloa, Mexico, and into Nevada and back and forth, and I already had my gear packed and ready to go out the door. When I received a phone call from the vice president of the board at that time. So I thought, okay, well, listen, see what's going on here. And then I heard the story and what was going on, and a good friend of mine, a very dear friend of mine, mentor Jess Sixkeller, who's a member of the Cherokee Nation. He was actually the first detective on the Chicago police force, and unfortunately was killed in a home invasion about 1.5 years ago. He was a remarkable man. But he encouraged me. He said, I want you to take this job. He said, it's really important. So I did. And I feel blessed to be able to have that this opportunity. In the last 3 years, it's been absolutely 24/7 engaged. It's a marvelous organization. We specialize again in 3 lines of business, and we know the fundamentals are education. We are also lenders now. We've just been certified by HUD to be originators of 184 loans. We're working with USDA RD for being certified for 502s. The staff is strong. We're small. We're 6 members, 4 Native, 1 and then 2 Hispanics. And so we are, the 3 ladies that are Navajo, they're fluent in Navajo, so they can speak with anyone at any time in their Navajo language, and that goes a long way. We also are developers, and we can provide construction services. When I joined the organization, it was apparent that the contractor that we had inherited, I think they were well-intended, but they ended up over their head in the time and distances associated with working on the Navajo Nation. So if they fell behind on a project 3 hours away, and that was with the housing authority, they would pull their team and send them there. Next minute, they'd be sending them 6 hours in another direction, and then finally getting back to us. In the meantime, the home buyers, future home buyers, are waiting, and nothing was happening. So we decided to take that over ourselves, and at this point, we have established a holding company and a construction subsidiary. And this is where we have determined that working with a blend of public and private funds is probably the way to go to ensure the quality, to ensure the cost, and to ensure the time frame that the construction process takes place. So it's been a very dynamic 3 years, and we came from the verge of going under when I joined to the excellent work of our staff pulling us out of that very dire condition, and now we're moving ahead and getting ready to start the construction of what we've identified as about 14 million in housing on and adjacent to the Navajo Nation in the next 24 to 36 months.
Great. Thank you very much. Star?
Good afternoon. I'm Star Means. I work for Thunder Valley CDC. I'm the Homeownership Program Manager there. And my closeness, I guess, to this topic is I was raised here in Minneapolis on the south side in the Powderhorn Park neighborhood. My father owns his house there currently still, even though he's trying to transition his way back home to South Dakota as well. But over 30 years ago, I don't know the exact number, but he bought his house from my mother's relatives for $55,000. And I always give this example in our education classes about this is what asset building is and this is what it means is way back when he purchased his house for $55,000. Now it's being appraised at over $210,000. So he can use that now as retirement income on top of the income that he is currently getting, because he is also a Vietnam veteran. So that's my closeness to home ownership, but having moved home almost 4 years ago now, I am learning. It's a totally different ball game when you're buying a house in the urban area on fee land to building a home in Pine Ridge. But Thunder Valley is building in a community on 34 acres, and it's fee land. We are starting out with 21 single-family homes. Currently, we have 4 homes up with 3 foundations poured. So we don't have, our tribal members do not have to go through the land process through the BIA, which on our reservation can take anywhere from 6 months to several years. So by the time you get them or by the time the land goes through and then you're working to get them qualified, I mean, by then, like they said, it could take, up to 5 years. We don't have an IDA program at Thunder Valley, but we partner, so I'm in charge of our Sustainable Home Ownership Project, which is a smaller kind of res-wide coalition, which we have native CDFIs like Lakota Funds and Mazaska, and we work with Partnership for Housing, Wild Horse Butte CDC, and Thunder Valley, I guess, just us. So yeah, so we work on more of just a res level to get through these obstacles that are put forth for our tribal homeowners. So.
Great, thank you. And wrapping it up with Russ.
Thanks, Mary. I'm Russ Caney with Enterprise. I'm the Director of Programs for the Rural Native American Initiative. For those of you that don't know Enterprise Community Partners, we were started in 1982 by James Rouse, a developer on the East Coast, and evolved into an organization that is all about affordable housing. We've tried to build platforms that address a lot of issues out there on affordable housing. I'm very happy to say that in 1997, Enterprise decided to start a Native American program based in Albuquerque, New Mexico. At the time, it was very focused. It was focused just on the 19 pueblos and 3 reservations in New Mexico. And they continued to work with tribal housing authorities, TDHEs, on home repairs, home maintenance, and on home ownership issues. That program got merged into our rural programs about 2008. And that's when I came on to work for the rural programs. I'd been with Enterprise since 2005. My background is in rural lending, rural housing, going back to 1979. But when I started with the tribal programs, I knew absolutely nothing about tribal housing, other than growing up in Burba, Wisconsin, near Ho-Chunk. So, Mike, you know how that was. So I had a lot to learn. And one thing they say about getting older, you continue to learn, and I have. And it's been a great experience working on these programs. I think one thing that Enterprise brings to the table is a lot of energy about tribal housing and a commitment to seeing through on a lot of programming and a lot of policy efforts. It's brought us in touch with some great organizations, great people. We're a very small staff, so we make every attempt we can to leverage all 500 plus employees of Enterprise into not only home ownership, but also rental housing and primarily on reservations.
Great, thank you very much. So we got started in the last panel hearing about some of the challenges that are faced, whether it's home ownership on tribal land or home ownership by Native families not on tribal land. So we got a long list of challenges. And what I'd like each of you to do is pick one of those challenges and imagine for a minute that you could wave a magic wand and have a solution that you have to that challenge be implemented. Which challenge would you pick and how would you change? Karen?
So I think a lot of tribes don't know that they have a lot more flexibility with their Indian housing block grant money than they do. They do it the same way it was always done because nobody ever told them it could be done differently. Not only that, but so we started using our block grant money for down payment assistance for those who met income qualifications. But what we also did was for those who were above HUD guidelines, we started using non-program income, the money that gets paid back to the program. It still has to be used for a housing purpose, but it doesn't have the original restrictions. So any of our tribal members who are within the service area, which is a 45-mile radius, but that also can be changed in your block grant. When you submit it, you can change your service area. We limit it just probably because we can't afford to do more. So we started doing down payment assistance. When partnering, I was the chair of the Minnesota Housing, or not the Minnesota Housing Finance, sorry, Minnesota Chippewa Tribe Finance Corporation. You know, they were able to offer other amenities, affordability buy downs and things like that. So when we started layering some of those things together, it made it seem much less daunting for tribal members. But we also put some restrictions on it. Everybody here said we need tribal members to understand about asset building and what it is. And so we required them to go through a home ownership class. We partner with the local nonprofit who had much more stability. I didn't want to keep training one staff person and having them leave, but really didn't need more. That nonprofit loved being able to add another diverse audience to their portfolio and brought some resources and credit counseling and things like that onto the reservation. All I did is said, I'll buy cookies and give you a free room. And they were like, yay. You know, so there's lots of win-win out there, I think, if we start to think differently. And I keep telling tribes when I talk to them, I'm like, do you know you can do this with your Indian housing block grant? And they just really don't know that they can do it. So that's a little bit where I was getting to, I think, with education to tribes about what is the whole menu of options that's available. That's a self-governance compact. So let's put the self-governance into the service delivery.
Great. Roland?
Sure. Well, there's never going to be enough NAHASDA funds to go around to meet the needs of the tribes. It's virtually impossible, especially in this day and age and going forward. So I believe if I could, you know, facilitate any wish that I have is to leverage the private funding sources that we have available, evaluate the needs of the client, determine what level of support that they're going to need, and then tailor make every home that you build to the needs of that client. So as it was discussed earlier, you know, some families will need over $200,000 in subsidies and down payment assistance. Others may need $35,000. Some will need $150,000. But if you build with private money, then orchestrate the takeout with a percentage of NAHASDA, a percentage of 184, or maybe it's a 502, then you can meet more needs than you can right now. If you build entirely with NAHASDA, then you're going to go through a procurement process, which, well, from my perspective, You know, and if I was selfish, I would say, okay, let's do a procurement. I'll go out and I'll bid for it. Then when the home that was built for $250 sells at $150, then I keep the difference of $100,000. What I'd like to see is the tribes using their money for the needs of their members and not just to fill my bank account. So I propose, if I had the magic wand, that we build with private funds, we have a fair return, the tribes retain as much of the Nahasda funds as they possibly can, and it may be instead of building 10 homes, they're building 15 homes, or instead of building 50, they're building 75 or 150, again, depending on the needs. So that, I think, is really important to take a look at that and use a very fluid formula that achieves everybody's needs. And it'll also take care of the essential families, which unfortunately are not always being taken care of.
Robert?
Yeah, thanks. If I could wave a magic wand, I think it would be to normalize home ownership within Native communities, either on reservation or off reservation. And so I grew up, my parents owned their home. My mom, who's not Native, came from a history of property ownership. For my dad, it was his first home, and my parents took me to the bank when they were doing their business, and so being inside a bank and dealing with bankers was a normal thing. I bought my first home at 22. Of my 7 siblings in my generation, all of us are homeowners, and all of us have contributed back to the community. There's 2 advanced degrees, a teacher, a preacher, a politician, people who are really engaged in their labor unions, and so much of this, I know for me and for my family, is based on the fact that we own homes and we sort of put down roots in our communities. And while I was at Little Earth, we worked with a local partner, CDLF Biguin, and we're trying to sort of normalize this idea of home ownership for some of the Little Earth residents. And so we had 2 women from the community, 2 Native women who were homeowners, and then some experts in a panel, much like this, with Little Earth residents. And very quickly, the Little Earth residents room only spoke to the 2 Native women who were homeowners. And these women spoke of their story, you know, watching late night TV and learning something about household financing from that and moving a step forward there. But the value of having women who had walked the walk and been through, moved from low income rental to home ownership, you could see the value of that to the rest of the community. So I think it's just making it normal within our community to own homes and then to be able to leverage those assets into either further wealth building or stability within the families.
Star, are you going to use your magic wand?
I work more on the ground, so like with clients and in our communities, whether it's with the education that we provide or the credit counseling that we provide or trying to find a lender for a certain client or whatever. But there's a lot of challenges that get in the way of home ownership, especially on the reservation. I don't think I could just pick one because land takes a long time, water and sewer for low-income families. Like IHS wants you to have a permanent structure there before they provide water and sewer, which a lender isn't going to give you a loan for a house without water and sewer. So for a low-income family, adding another, $20,000, $30,000 onto their loan for water and sewer, I mean, how is that going to be available, affordable for a low-income family? So it's really, I think we need to get a good group together to really look at the systems that are in place and just really break them down. Where are they bottling up? Because it's more than just, 1 or 2 challenges. There's a lot of challenges to home ownership, especially on the reservation, and especially where we are in Pine Ridge. And that's why Thunder Valley is building the development that they are building. And we're going totally net zero, so it'll be totally solar, so it decreases the utility costs for the families, so then they are just paying their mortgage payment, and the solar isn't getting added on to the mortgage because the solar company is donating it to a nonprofit. So our CDC then owns all the solar and the development, which then creates more jobs because you need installers, people to be able to repair and things like that. So I don't think there's one or two challenges that I could really pick because it's just so complex that you just can't pick just one.
Russ, are you going to use your magic wand?
Well, if I had one, I think I would go back to the education piece that Jewel mentioned before, and it's so important. I was amazed when I first started working in the tribal housing area about the lack of technical assistance, lack of resources, lack of some of the just information that really needs to be generated and distributed. And I think I see a lot more activity in that area. One thing that I'll bring up as an example, and I think it's a great example that I've run into, for the last 8-9 years or so, I've been attending the South Dakota Housing Conference in Pierre, South Dakota. And it's sponsored by the South Dakota Housing Finance Agency, a sister agency to Mary's agency here. But they deal in all types of housing and have lots of responsibilities. But they also have large areas of the state that are reservations and a large tribal population. When I first started going to that conference, there was no participation from Native Americans in that conference. And you kind of look around and you start scratching your head a bit, and you're wondering, where is the exclusion here? Why aren't there breakout sessions and more information and such being discussed? About 3.5 years ago, there was a coalition that was put together for tribal home ownership in South Dakota. They had a day-long session before the housing conference started, and I expected, and I was invited, and I expected to go into that room and see the usual suspects, 15, 20 people that you see that typically come to some of these meetings and kind of an organizational meeting, and there was well over 100 people there, and the tribes were represented. And since then, it's been an educational process in that state, embedded in the conference with breakout sessions, with summer tour of tribal housing. This year, the summer tour is going to Pine Ridge and stopping at a number of organizations that are all working together. They have relationships. They're leveraging their resources off of each other for home ownership and rental housing, improving those in South Dakota. It's been going on 3.5 years. It's a great example where we see that happening there with a coalition involving all the tribes, and we have the same thing going on in New Mexico, and I think there's a great opportunity to do that in other states. I think a lot of these solutions are community-based. I'm absolutely excited about the Center for Indian Country Development getting involved on a national basis. It was timely, it came in at the right time, but again, going back to the communities, and that's really where it starts.
Very good. I have to say I was a little bit shocked that nobody used their magic wand to improve the land approval process. We heard it from several people. Is that just because it's even beyond the powers of a magic wand, or?
It's not, though. I mean, Congress passed the HART Act, and the president signed it, and so there's been a lot more control that tribes can take. It's getting them to implement it and to get their own governmental house in order under that act and submit it. Now, that all being said, Fond du Lac took over its land leasing before the HART Act. I just assumed that we had the powers of self-governance, and I didn't ask. We just started doing it, and then they said, okay. And then they, and so they really didn't have a good reason to say that I couldn't do it because it was civil regulatory, right? So tribes always had that inherent authority, but now you have this additional blessing and, of course, procedures and paperwork to fill out. So that solution is there should tribes wish to undertake it. But I think a lot of it's capacity. You're going to need staff. You're going to probably need some legal counsel, either in-house or out-of-house, to bring you through it. Some ordinances. If you really want to take it to the next level, then you're going to want to develop, land use and zoning, and, perhaps your tribal court systems and things like that as well. So I think a lot of it is when you're dealing with basic human needs and other kind of more immediate concerns, that seems a little not as an immediate concern, even though it's a part of that continuum of services that builds individual self-sufficiency in your citizens.
And it sounds to me like a common thread is there are some best practices out there, or mentors, or, there are some good things happening, but they're pretty dispersed, and maybe some more identifying those and disseminating that information.
And helping with
starts to get-
capacity.
Yeah. All right, so I'm going to go first to Robert on this next question because of the way you answered the last one. And that is, I heard a lot about lack of trust in banking and lending systems, especially after the mortgage foreclosure crisis. You talked about the fact that when you were growing up, you went to the bank with your parents, and that you have overcome that. But what ideas do you have for financial institutions to make the connection with Native peoples?
Thanks. So down on Franklin Avenue on the American Indian Cultural Corridor, we actually have a Native-owned bank that located there. It's Woodlands National Bank, owned by Mille Lacs. My organization, NACD, in its early years, convened community at all levels in all places to craft what we call the American Indian Community Blueprint. And this idea of having these kinds of institutions like banks that were sort of Native-friendly, reflected the community, really came through in that document. So NACD went around to Native organizations. Woodlands set a threshold of banking they needed at that site, and so we got commitments from other Native nonprofits to meet that threshold. Cited the branch right on the American Indian Cultural Corridor, and it's been tremendously successful. Banking at all different... Here, all right, and so having a Native-owned bank that understands the community, that reflects the community, has been really, really important. And then working with community partners, trusted community advocates or organizations like Bigiwin that I mentioned earlier, that's Native operated, Native staff that really understands this, what might be a 5-year process to become eligible to qualify for some kind of mortgage. And I think that's important, that people, whether it's delivering the service or discussing the challenges, it's having Native faces, people who understand the journey that the applicant has been on. I think that is really key. And so this idea of trusted community intermediaries, trusted organizations, I think is vital. And I've heard a lot of that interest here, and part of it is coming to the communities. You see from the people that are here, from what we've heard, there's a lot of work going on around this within the Native communities. And so then for the non-Native banks or the organizations that want to support Native home ownership, it's finding those organizations and partnering with those and putting the Native faces up front.
Very good. Roland, you're nodding pretty vigorously. You want to add to this dialogue?
I can't say enough about making sure that you know the community, that you do have the Native faces. If, let's say in our case, where Navajo is spoken frequently, that you have somebody who can address the needs in Navajo, especially among the elders, because a lot of the Navajo didn't learn English until they're 7, 8, 9 years old. And so if you can't speak with those families, you're totally out of sync with them. So you need to be able to address that. And So although we've changed our name, we originally founded 20 years ago as Navajo Partnership for Housing, and a lot of the adjacent tribes thought that they couldn't work with us, we couldn't work with them. So we changed the name in the last year to Native Partnership for Housing, and as we start to grow and increase our footprint, we'll definitely be looking at Hickory Apache, we'll be looking at Pima, we'll be looking at other tribes. So we want to make sure every tribe we interface with is a member of that tribe to communicate with those families and individuals.
Very good. Star, any thoughts on financial institutions?
I think just coming to our table or coming to our communities, maybe sponsoring stuff for our youth or different housing events will help. I know Jewel Burnett does a really good job in our area out in South Dakota, and I just want to recognize him because he knows what he's doing out there. So we have a few good connections out there. So.
Great. Karen, any thoughts?
We started requiring it of the banks that wanted to do business with us as a government and with our corporate entities. They say they send you a relationship manager. Well, the relationship starts with more than our money sitting in your bank. The relationship has to be meaningful, and that means bringing your resources into whether it's our school or, credit classes, things like that. So we made them put their money where their mouth was.
Very good. Russ, anything to add on that?
I really don't, other than, if you go to a reservation, remote reservations, which I travel to frequently, there is just a lack of any bank institution, any physical building, any physical presence. I know there's been a concerted effort for federal credit unions to be established. There's been an effort by a number of CDFIs to start them. And they've taken, the approach of we really want to participate in this whole credit repair, building credit, establishing credit exercise. And so you're seeing microloans, as small as $500, $1,000 being made, being repaid. You're seeing rents that are being reported to credit bureaus so that there's an establishment of a record of payments that are, just kind of building on that whole process of building a credit history that you can rely on later.
Very good. I know that I was just up in Net Lake last fall, and you have a new credit union right in the tribal community building. So right there where people come for their other business and hopefully build some relationships there. I was intrigued by the issue that Major brought up about the whole idea of home ownership and whether it's actually equity building for the person that lives there now, or is it equity building to transfer to the next generation. And certainly it strikes me as a person not knowledgeable that might be particularly the case on tribal land. Any thoughts about, is that a different cultural approach? Do you need to be prepared to sort of teach both? We heard Mike Gozi talking about the houses across the street from each other. Is it you can do either, you can have either attitude, or what do you think about that?
I've seen both. Our board president, Ron Maldonado, received the first mortgage ever in the Navajo Nation, and he has had many conversations with me recently, and he did build equity, and he did need access to that equity. And yet there are others who that is not top of mind. As soon as they acquired the home, they brought in all their family members, and they planned succession immediately within the week. So they weren't thinking about cash value, they were thinking of value for the family, that was the center for their family. And it would go down through the generations. So I've seen both.
Very good. Anyone else on that topic?
I think we've spent a lot of time really talking to tribal members about what are the implications of each of the options. We've had our first families come through that went through the mutual help, the old HUD program, and actually paid off their homes and then tried to get home equity loans. only to not be able to find a lender because it wasn't their first home and all of these other things. So that was really a gap in the financial industry. But you see them really being thoughtful about what is for young people. And I actually think that a lot of young people are looking at homeownership. Some like the idea that it's not a program of the tribal government. They want a piece of their life separated and don't want to be in program housing. Some have a non-native spouse and they're worried about land and possession issues if something should happen to the native spouse. And then I have a whole bunch of elders right now who are either selling their homes because they don't want the maintenance. They're cashing out, but then they're wanting to access some kind of subsidized housing again in their elder years, which makes it difficult once you've already been a homeowner. Or else they're looking at succession within their family. Some of them have involuntarily given up their homes because one of their children needed it and then needed program housing again. For the ones that are cashing out, they're pretty savvy in learning that it really is just creating a down payment if you leave a tribal home before it's fully paid off. You're only going to get a portion of what you put into it, and they're using that for down payments, like almost treating it like a starter home, but starting to become a little bit more savvy around actually just staying until it's done, so that then they have the full value of that home to work with. What we've also learned is that we can buy some of those homes back with our non-program income and or our NAHASDA block grants as well. So we're keeping them within housing stock and helping to create options. So you really see the whole gamut of options. But the interesting thing is there's different tools that need to be available along the way. We can't keep buying our own houses back with our NAHASDA money because then we're not increasing capacity, right? Yet a small portion of that for down payment assistance took somebody off the list. So really looking at, whether it's MHFA money to help keep the housing stock fresh, sellable, maintaining the market value so that they are able to maintain that asset. But I mean, somebody said, NAHASDA money only goes so far, and that's true, but it's playing so many different roles for our families.
A thought that comes to mind, and maybe it's food for thought when we get to the tables, is it strikes me that there may be some similarities between the way community land trusts work and the way that tribal land works, where the land stays in trust, but the value is in the housing. But in that case, the community land trust does have the first right of refusal to buy the house back, and might just be interesting to look at whether there's some
Fond du Lac
parallels.
work with the land trust for those families that might have a non-native spouse for downtown housing just off the reservation, and then we help them acquire the houses that they rehabbed. The agreement they gave back to us is that family would always be replaced with a Fond du Lac tribal member, being at least one of the partners. So creativity wins the day.
Yeah. Exactly. One of the questions we talked about a little bit was, we talk a lot about first-time home buyers and the young people, and I really liked the thought that Paul left us with about really having as a goal that young people would buy a house on the reservation. But there's another question, and that is there an opportunity later in life for families that are currently renting for that first-time home buyer not happening in their 20s or 30s, but maybe happening in their 40s and 50s? Is that something that can begin to turn things around?
It's a case by case. We have people who have retired from the BIA and have purchased one of our homes. So then you have, we're getting ready to start another phase of housing, and we have young families that are coming forward. So it's all over the spectrum. One of the biggest challenges is we have families coming into our office and they're being evicted because they got a raise. They're no longer qualified for housing. So all of a sudden now they're commuting great distances. To give you perspective in the distances that we cover from where our office is in the southern central edge of the Navajo Nation to the northwestern corner is a 5-hour drive. And so if you're in the interior, there are families that the working members of their families are getting up at 5 o'clock in the morning and getting on tribal transportation to get to their office by 8. Then they repeat it at the end of the day and day in and day out. So they're if you make too much money and you're only in tribal housing, you've got a problem. So one of the things, one of the areas we're filling is for the families that are 80.15% of USMI. So we have to take care of those needs and the over income as well as the lower income if at all possible. The Navajo Nation, for the most part, can take care of those families that are under 80%, and then those over are very challenged. And literally sleeping on the couches or in a travel trailer that they park at families' home site leases.
So the challenges of those, the requirements of the NAHASDA money, is that where we're...
Any NAHASDA money is restricted to 80% and under. So that's a challenge. So if you send your children to school and they come back and they're a dentist or they're a nurse, they're not qualified to live in tribal housing. And there is no housing stock to meet that need.
Very interesting. I wonder if there are good examples, and yet there might not be because of what you just talked about, but are there good examples of tribal enterprises that employ tribal members engaging in IDA accounts or wealth building savings accounts out of their paychecks? Is that a linkage? Because we heard a lot about the fact that it's tough to become a homeowner if you don't have a job. So has that linkage been made for those who are employed by tribal enterprises? Don't know? Does anybody know in the room? I'm just curious.
I know there was some, like, through community action, some of that going around for a while, but I think some of those sources that help leverage that have kind of dried up.
One question that I want to put Russ on the spot for, because I know he knows about this topic, is that in Minnesota, and I know in other states as well, there's been low-income housing tax credit developments that have been built that are actually detached single-family homes. And the idea was that those homes, after 15 years of being rental, would be sold to the people that had been living in them or others in the community. And I know that we've been a little slow in Minnesota to be able to turn those over. And the young lady from Bois Forte mentioned that sometimes it's an issue of how low the rents are while they're rental properties. Any thoughts about whether that eventual tenant ownership model still holds promise for?
Well, I think it does, and I'll give the state of Minnesota credit because in 2013, and Rick remembers this well because he gathered a lot of folks into a big room, and we wanted to talk about conversion of low-income housing tax credit homes into potential home ownership. And it was an issue kind of on the agenda, but we're kind of really not knowing where to go and really having a policy and such. And so I think at the time, Red Lake was probably the first low-income housing tax credit development that had the opportunity to make that conversion. And really, it's their choice. They own the housing, they get the investor out, they take the housing back. They can continue to use it as rentals, and that may work perfectly fine. But there is an option there under the code. But at the same time, there has to be a policy, and I know you made an investment in tax credits. Equity came in from private investors. So you really want to see that housing sustainable. And how are you going to do that if you have a home ownership conversion plan? We're all sitting in the room and all looking at each other, and basically after 10 minutes, we realized there was no policy. So to your credit, the staff went to work and worked with the tribes in Minnesota to come up with a policy. And that process has been put in place, I think, as of September of 2015. You now have a policy that includes credit counseling and repairs to the home before it's transferred, and so all the major issues have been addressed. I have not seen that in other states. So we're working hard right now in New Mexico, where we have the same situation where there's some investments that have been made in the tax credit program, single-family homes on pueblos, and they've gone through year 15. They're getting the housing back, the investors out, but there hasn't been that process established. It is very important that a process be established, and if the pueblo or the tribe decides they want to make that conversion, then there's everybody in agreement. You don't have to work out all those details down the road. So it's established in Minnesota. I'm glad it is. If it hasn't been used, that's okay. The tribes prefer to use them as rentals. I mean, it's their choice.
Oh, sure. No, I understand that. I'm just, I know that we have one that's in the works. Isn't that right, Rick? We actually have a couple that are in the works, so we just haven't crossed the bar yet with that. But I wanted people who may not be aware of that option. And I don't really know. Do we know, Russ, what the inventory is around the country of those single-family low-income housing tax credit developments?
You know, I do
tribal
not.
land?
I know in the early years of the program, and we got involved underwriting some of the first tribal LIHTC deals. We were asked by Fannie Mae to do that. They had an Indian Country Fund and then a second fund. Raymond James and Enterprise both did the underwriting for those. And that was really the preferred model at the time, of having a single-family home, detached. That's the families preferred to live that way, not next to each other, maybe more of a multi-family configuration. We're seeing less of that depending on land cost or just the cost of infrastructure these days is probably causing less of that type of setup, but you're still seeing quite a bit of investment in single-family homes. But I don't have the numbers, but there's quite a few out there.
All right. I'm just thinking we might have a follow-up, Russ, because you know, finding out where they are, which states they're in, and we could certainly share what we've learned together with the tribal leaders and put down on paper now with our colleagues in other states.
Sure.
Very good.
Thank you. Thank you. Any final comments, Mary?
No, I just really hope that the next part of this project, we've given you some ideas to talk about problem solving. So, Patrice?
Okay, thank you. Let's give Mary a